Knight delicately responded to that Netflix tweet simply with this one. True crime stories are certainly having a moment in today's zeitgeist, and podcasts the last several years have really been responsible for a lot of this growth, undeniably so. Our first guest tonight believes that true crime is a vehicle we all use to talk about otherwise very scary and very important things, examining why we are all so obsessed with this genre. Rebekah Sebastian of the podcast Dialogue joins me now. Rebekah, thanks a lot for taking the time. Look, people continue to be incredibly obsessed over all these horrific crimes and the details behind them. Before we get into the specifics here of Mr. Bundy and why there are so many Ted Bundy-based projects, much to the consternation of Twitter users everywhere, give us a sense to open things up here. What makes this world so fascinating? Why can't we stop watching and listening to these stories?
Great question, JD. I'm so happy to talk about this because this is the conversation we're having in the true crime community and on my podcast, Dialogue. Why are we not watching? I think humans, for as long as time, have been interested in death, and true crime allows us to get close to that topic without being in danger ourselves. I think women in particular, we make up almost 90% of the consumption in this genre. We are the ones watching and listening to these shows and podcasts, really want to get close and really want to maybe understand. And I think there's a self-protection aspect to it. I talk to a lot of women that I interview, and we're all hoping maybe there's something I will pick up watching one of these shows or listening to one of these podcasts that I can remember if I find myself in a situation where I'm in danger. So I think those are just two of the many reasons why true crime is so popular. But at its core, it's great storytelling, right? Beginning, middle, and an end.
Did you say 90%?
That's right. It's predominantly women, and that goes for most podcasts and the genre as a whole. It's women turning up to CrimeCon, which is a national gathering of thousands of true crime fans. That's probably over 70% women. It's mostly women, which maybe is how this Ted Bundy thing got started.
Sure. Okay, so let's go there right now. Give me your sense on some of the most, I guess, gripping content that you've come across, and why the fascination. I think when people name off the most notorious serial killers, there tend to be a bunch, John Wayne Gacy's of the world, but Ted Bundy is always like the first name that gets mentioned. What is your best sense? And this isn't this part, although the podcast emphasis may be newer, clearly films and TV shows have to some degree almost glamorized this guy for many years. I mean, we get Hollywood's leading A-list hunks to play this guy. I get he may have been conceived or, viewed as being somewhat handsome as a suspect in and of himself, but there is a fascination Hollywood has. Why is that?
Well, I think first of all, because he was baseline average looking, we've made him really good looking because he wasn't an absolute nightmare or ogre to look at. So I think it's generous to call him good looking, frankly. And second of all, I guess because he was a normal guy, or at least came off as one and was charming and charismatic. Those words get thrown around a lot. Of course, we know at his core he wasn't, but I guess that compelled a lot of people to be interested. But again, I think it's almost this bad boy complex. Women may be drawn to men who are bad, wanting to change them. That's been going on forever as well. This is that like times a million. And I do think we are like at a moratorium on Ted Bundy content. I think like we're good. I think there's other stories in true crime to be told. And you asked about compelling stories. I think it's compelling that a few of his victims are alive and they're sharing their stories. There's one in particular, Kathy Kleiner, who survived her attack and speaks about it. And I don't think people know her name. She is somebody we should be talking about,
Mm-hmm. And so you said Kathy Klein, right? Is her name? Because I did want to ask you about the victims, because there had been some conversation to say, okay, can we stop with like the Zac Efrons of the world? Can we put up photos? Can we tell some of the stories? What do we know about some of those victims? Obviously, there were so many who were taken from us who don't have the opportunity to tell their stories, but there were also a lot of women who had close calls. What do we know about them based on your years in this space, Rebekah?
Yeah, sure. Well, there were 20 confirmed murders by Ted Bundy and possibly up to 30 that are not as proven. But I personally was able to speak with Kathy Kleiner. I know some of his victims who are still alive choose not to speak to the press, and that's completely understandable and well within their rights. Kathy chose to speak out, and that was part of her healing process. So it's It's as difficult as you could imagine. She has severe PTSD. She had to leave college. This completely altered her life. And, something that's surprising is that people didn't actually rush to speak to her. It was almost a decade before she had her first interview. So I think that maybe says something about how media has changed, but she talked about it in the sense of, I don't think people knew what to do with her. So the media wasn't reaching out. Her friends and family didn't really know how to respond to it. So she was lonely and isolated in this experience that so few other people have. So that's extremely isolating and lonely. So giving her a space to talk about that, having her on my podcast, she's been on others, seeing her speak live, I think that's so important for people to remember, to take a moment. If you want to see the movie, but real people were impacted by his horrific actions. And I think at the core of true crime, we have to remember that every time we watch anything.
Well, thank you for your work to put a spotlight on voices like that. And thank you for bringing up, and I'm glad that we could spend a good part of this portion of this interview talking about this. I'd love to continue this conversation at some point. I hope you will rejoin the show, because this is certainly a moment we're having in the world that you're covering, which is endlessly fascinating, that is certainly not going away anytime soon. That is true crime host of the Dialogue podcast, Rebekah Sebastian. Rebekah, thanks a lot for being here.